You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, that are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 181, entitled Dying Earth and Living Cosmos, The Living Gifts of Anthroposophy, The Need for New Forms of Consciousness by Rudolf Steiner. This is Lecture 11, which is the fifth lecture in the second cycle. There are 3 cycles in this book. The 5th out of 7 lectures in The Living Gifts of Anthroposophy. Lecture 11, given in Berlin on the 9th of April, 1918. As I have often said in recent lectures, throughout human evolution, esoteric truths have always been available to certain individuals, albeit by drawing on sources other than ours. However, such individuals made very certain that these truths were not communicated to people who were not initiated into esoteric mysteries, but were carefully guarded. As we know, traditions are perpetuated even when they lose their meaning and justification, as humanity in general develops. Today, certain truths are still kept a closely guarded secret by those aware of them, and yet many such things ought no longer to remain concealed, but like other scientific truths, must be made available to humanity in general. While this can only be done in relation to certain basic ideas, where these are concerned, it must happen. Matters we have been discussing for a long time now include some of these carefully guarded truths and insights. The spirit of our inquiries makes it necessary for us to continue to delve into these secrets. Those who receive them, to whom they are communicated in a simple form, need to recognize from their very nature that they must be treated with great seriousness, with a certain degree of reverence. You see, part of the reason that initiates today are reluctant to communicate such truths is a prevailing lack of reverence for the truth in modern humanity. It is, of course, hard to summon much reverence for the supposed truths of a modern materialistic outlook, and not much harm is done, at least apparently, by meeting such things without reverence. But certain matters do have to be handled with respect and reverence if they are to properly find their way into general human culture. Here I would include knowledge about the human being himself. These insights may seem fairly simple to begin with, but are in fact of very great scope and import. Our recent observations in particular, concerned ultimately with the connection between our life here in a physical body and life between death and rebirth, relate to a great deal that is of intimate significance for our understanding of human nature. Today, therefore, let us first focus our spiritual gaze on things we have already spoken about from other perspectives. We will do so now only from a certain angle, in a way that can allow us to pick up the thread of themes we have been addressing in these lectures. As you know, modern science sees the human being in very close proximity to the animals, failing, as we have stressed, to consider what distinguishes us from them. For instance, it highlights the great resemblance between the shape of bones in the human being and in animals, a great similarity in their shape and morphology. This is correct, but fails to discern the most important thing. As I described last winter in a public lecture, if we approach human life with the necessary reverence and depth, fully pondering on the very significant difference that exists between a person alive on earth and a human corpse, we can discern a mystery, a secret, in this impression of polarity between the living person and the corpse. The first thing that can strike us is that powers of external nature, to which the body was not subject from conception or birth through to death, now lay claim to the corpse. The living person was not touched by these forces, due to the living, feeling entity connected with the substances constituting the body. If we trace in thoughts what happens to the corpse, irrespective of whether it is cremated or decomposes more slowly, we can see that the processes involved are basically the same, just occur at different speeds. The substances cohering in the living person dissolve, either slower or faster, into the substances at work in the whole earth. With our ordinary senses and thinking, we can trace everything that happens to the parts and substances of a corpse. The spiritual scientist, however, can take these observations further, finding that substances in the corpse immediately after death gradually transform into a vast field of substances. Naturally, this takes hundreds of years, but the substances of the corpse dissolve slowly into a vast complex of substances, into the totality of what constitutes our whole visible, externally perceptible world. Now, it is interesting to study the connection between our capital I consciousness here in physical life and this decomposing corpse, which strangely are related to each other in a certain way. When I say capital I consciousness, I naturally do not mean our real, actual I, since this passes through the gate of death and continues to live between death and rebirth, but the picture of the I as it hovers before us here in physical life. Since we do not have consciousness of the I as such, but possess only a picture of the I in our consciousness, is bound to the body, to the corpse, and in particular to the complex of substances that gradually dissolves into the universe after death. This dissolution of the corpse into the universe is nothing other than the outward picture of our whole I consciousness. For in reality, this consciousness belongs to the universe into which the corpse resolves. The self-evident perspective we have during our life, that we exist within the confines of our skin, which an esotericist regards actually as a very peculiar notion, is due only to the fact that the substances of our body cohere between birth and death. We always ascribe our existence to the fact that we fill this defined space with our flesh and blood. Actually, this is absurd. We are not here at all. In reality, we are everywhere. And during sleep, try in fact to spread out wherever the substance particles of our body will be after death. During our lifetime, we have the illusory sense that we exist in a particular spatial context defined by our skin. Actually, this is a Maya which we learn, and among the many other things death is, it is also the refutation of this illusory consciousness of the physical material world. Death bears the particles of our corpse to where our I consciousness in fact always dwells. This has far-reaching importance. But now we can ask what it is that after death carries our I consciousness and its outward image, the particles of our body, out into the wide world. What forces are they? There are three forces involved, and we can try to gain an idea of them as follows. The first manifests during our life by virtue of the fact that we crawl on all fours in our earliest infancy and subsequently stand vertically. We only gradually find an upright orientation, a vertical alignment. As we transform ourselves from the crawling infant into an upright person, we follow a particular force orientation into which we place ourselves and with which we identify. In terms of spiritual science, this direction of force is very clearly visible in us. A line runs through us from below, passing from the earth's center out into the universe. In ancient times, this line, passing from the Earth's center into the universe, was described as different for each person, and even at every moment in time. And yet it was always seen as passing outward into the universe from the center of the Earth. That is one of the important lines of force in the human being. It acts only for as long as this physical life of ours lasts, for the physical gravity of our body holds it in balance. The moment this physical gravity is no longer working as it did on the living body, that is, at the moment this body becomes a corpse, this line of force passing from the center of the Earth out into the universe starts to disperse and bear away the particles of our body. Naturally, they are driven further by their own gravity. But if we were to observe what happens with these particles for a long enough time, we would find that they disperse in the direction in which this force carries them, even if this takes centuries. The second force we must consider here is one that primarily comes to expression in human speech. As we speak, there is a certain impetus in our articulated language. It imparts a certain momentum to the air we exhale. The spiritual scientist sees this power as one that winds itself around the first. Basically, it has a spiral form, encircling this vertical line. It is a force that modifies the purely dispersing trajectory of the other and imparts momentum to it. But as well as this second force, there is also a third, originating in the following. Whereas speaking develops a certain outward momentum, thinking, which is what distinguishes us from the animals, opposes this power coming to expression in speech. Here we have the third force. If we were to draw this, it would be like this, and there's a drawing. By these three powers, the vertical trajectory, the power at work in speech, and the one at work in thinking, the particles of the human corpse are gradually guided out into the universe. Of course, gravity opposes them, and other forces, chemical ones, for instance. But these three powers overcome what counteracts them. These three forces that cohere during our physical life, when we stand on two legs, are emancipated and disperse the form that was previously held together. What we call the ether body, or body of formative forces, also especially follows the direction of these three forces after death. This happens a few days after death, and we have often described it as the dissolution of the ether body. The dispersal and dissolution of the physical body is less important for the dead. It reminds them of the moment of death, fixes it, and so sustains their memory of their earthly I. More important than this is that these forces reveal to the dead soul the ongoing lawfulness of the dissolution of the ether body. But if nothing other than these three forces existed, the dead soul could not know that it is his own form, that it in fact originates with him. He would perceive it as something alien. It is important that he not only perceives the process of dissolution, but that he is also able to recognize its connection with him, its origin in him. That he sees these are the remains of what he made cohere on earth in his human form. And this leads us to something else. Here I have to refer to something which really is not treated with the necessary reverence nowadays, in our dry, prosaic times, even though we see it before us all the time. This is something apparent to everyone, and yet its appearance is one of the most mysterious of phenomena, although its mysterious character is not felt. This is the incarnation tone of the human face, the outward skin color. Something very individual comes to expression in the tone of each person's skin. It is slightly, subtly different in everyone, with as many tinges and nuances as there are people. If you concern yourself with this riddle of individual human skin color, as some have tried to do, you will gain a sense of what comes to expression in this flesh color. Something very mysterious indeed manifests here. If we study the phenomenon through spiritual science, the question about the, quote, incarnation hue, close quote, acquires very great significance, for it depends on two opposing forces, or one could say, on two pressure forces active in us and working against each other in the human form. In a sense, the ether body, or body of formative forces, presses outward, while the astral body presses inward, and this happens everywhere. Whereas the astral body seeks to contract, to push inward from without, so the ether body tries to push outward from within, to expand. What comes to expression in our human flesh color, the color of incarnation, arises partly from the encounter of these two opposing pressures from without and from within. Our skin color mysteriously expresses what the ether body and the astral body have to say to one another. We see this flesh bloom in people here on the physical plane. But if we could observe it from within, it would appear different. Looking from within outward, the tinge of your skin as an average European would not look flesh pink, but greenish blue. The after effect of this greenish blue tone also becomes apparent after death. As our etheric body, or body of formative forces, expands in line with the three forces previously characterized, and the dead person gazes upon this figure or pattern, he sees his flesh color in its after effect from the other side. After death it shimmers toward him in a greenish blue color. But this hue also contains something essentially different from its outward appearance in physical life. Strictly speaking, this color of incarnation is not only mysteriously different in every individual, but it also changes in each of us during our lifetime. I'm not referring to the fact that when suffering from one or another kind of illness, our skin sometimes looks roseate, sometimes more curd-like, for these are of course abnormal conditions. Apart from these greater fluctuations, the incarnation color also continually subtly changes. But when seen from the other side, as the dead person sees it, something else becomes apparent. This hue reveals our whole world of memory, as if embroidered on a tapestry. If we speak pictorially, therefore, we can describe this incarnation tapestry as a kind of garment, a very fine one, which has been turned inside out as one turns a dress or a glove inside out. Then we see the inner lining, as it were, of what is usually turned outward, which, because it is hidden from view, we can only perceive by virtue of it coming to our awareness as memory, rather than the content of thought as such. It is something that gives thoughts their diverse auric colors, their living resonance. We only come to know the outward life of what we send down into our subconscious. We do not become aware of how this glitters through our skin color, but the dead become aware of it in the after effect of this incarnation hue. When the dead soul looks back on the dissolution of the body of formative forces, he has it before him as memory, and then he knows that he is this. He realizes, I am this. Spiritual scientific research shows that something mainstream science gives little attention to, the great difference between man and animal, is expressed in our upright gait, our capacity for speech, for articulated speech, and the capacity for thinking, powers which we bear with us out into the universe after death. And the incarnation color of our skin is the physical expression here of what goes on working after death as a residue of memory. After death, therefore, we impart ourselves to the universe. And what we possess here and manifest in our physical body are the outer signs of our cosmic nature and being. This is what gives us a sense of uniting with something so mysterious in the color of incarnation, a feeling of the universal significance of what we observe in the human being. By virtue of our incarnation hue, more than anything else, we are a microcosm in relation to the macrocosm. This ground tone of color is very significant, for it is, we can say, the color of the tapestry upon which the dead person's memory appears, in greenish or greenish-blue tones for white people, purple-reddish for Japanese, and flesh-pink color for black people after death. These things are intimately and significantly related to the life between death and rebirth, and are a preparation for a new incarnation. They lead someone to choose a particular nation or race in a new life. Studying the life of spirit is not to satisfy mere intellectual curiosity. Our life here in the physical world, along with things that make mysterious impressions upon our sensibility, can only be explained and understood if we consider this life in its real relationship with spiritual reality. As you may now realize, though the things I have been describing are presented here in fairly basic form and can be further elaborated, we can gain an intimate awareness of human nature and development in general by studying these matters in more detail. People today are wary of looking so attentively at human nature and development. They don't want to engage with it. On the other hand, as I have often said, there are those who stand guard over certain concealed esoteric truths and enjoy the power of sole possession of such truths. This has extremely important ramifications. However little inclined people are to believe this, there are some who seek to further their plans for world dominion by studying in their centers of occultism how world evolution develops, and how they can best exert power over humanity over the next 30, 40, or 50 years. Nations where such figures work, studying the course of human evolution and how to influence it, and then establishing political life to further their interests accordingly, will of course have an advantage over others where this is not done. These things play a major role in global reality. We are living at a time when it would be necessary for people to be aware of such things. Today I will only speak of one related matter. Current events are of catastrophic proportions, and in purely outward terms, to a superficial view, they exceed anything previously played out in humanity's history. And yet they are only part of a larger, more encompassing context, which we can only properly understand if we bring the necessary reverence and seriousness to bear upon it. In certain places, a good deal is already known about humanity's evolution. But this knowledge is carefully guarded with the aim of giving power to its possessors. I do not know whether you will be skeptical about this. I say things in a way that leaves everyone free to give credence if you think what I say is credible, or withhold it. Today in the English-speaking world, certain impulses which we may try to describe in more detail on a future occasion are striving for world dominion on a global scale. I am not speaking out of some kind of Central European chauvinism, but present to you merely the results of spiritual scientific inquiry. The figures in Anglo-American life who possess this knowledge would be the last ones to repudiate it, though they might very well deny it, to make absolutely sure that it does not come to public attention. Those in the know are, for instance, aware of the following, which I will try to illustrate by broadening the context for a moment. During the course of human evolution, thus from the third and fourth post-Atlantean epoch onward into our fifth epoch, as materialism emerged and took shape, former truths became devalued, really lost their currency and value. In old traditions, you can discover the deepest truths in the guise of pictures. Myth, images, and pictures are something that modern people only accept as poetic fancy. They accept a playwright such as Strindberg, for instance, because he seems to clothe what he says in poetic form. And yet, they do not regard poetic works as anything to be believed. Nothing in them is thought to express reality. Mythic and pictorial expression has been devalued, and people no longer feel that the imagination offers deeper underlying truth. In the course of the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, this process will increasingly extend to language itself amongst the English-speaking peoples. Besides devaluing images as a mode of expression, the word itself will be devalued. In the same way that materialistic outlooks oppose the image today, so, in future, they will join battle with the word. People will come to say that words are not a fitting means of expressing truth. In his title Critique of Language, Fritz Mautner has already tried to make language the culprit for all the superstitions said to prevail amongst humanity. But while his tool may be sharp enough, for his critique is an apt instrument, he is working with an unsuitable material, with the German language, and is deceiving himself. English-speaking occultists, however, have a suitable material in the English language. In its developmental impulse of devaluing meaningful content, this language is increasingly left with the mere elaborations of words. Consider its abstract trails of words and all that is overlooked and passed over by this means. If you have studied English philosophy, you will find that its language has lost any real wealth of inner content. Read John Stuart Mill or Herbert Spencer, for instance. The language they use offers no means to enter and engage with the spirit. Here we can see how language is a very important factor in the way English-speaking occultists approach the problem of language. And this lies in the very nature of modern impulses. Drawing on occult foundations, such people dream up ways and means of exerting world dominion without resorting to language. And this represents a great contrast between Orient and Occident. The Orient with its acutely alive intensity of language, and the Occident with its dismissal of language's inner meaning. The Central European, once again, occupies a position midway between these two extremes. What is at work here? It is being shouted as loudly as possible from the rooftops to further the interests of various nations is actually very deceitful. It seeks, again, this is not chauvinism, but is drawn from the most sober spiritual scientific appraisal, to conceal the truth, which is that efforts to secure power are being undertaken in a realm where, through its own process of development, language is losing its dominance. The great, incisive, catastrophic events of our times are symptoms of this wide-ranging, all-encompassing battle, which will inevitably find diverse expression in the near future in conflicts across the globe. This will not be like other previous wars, which concluded with peace. Things will no longer be as they used to be. There will instead be perpetual conflicts. And the only way to view the incisive events of our time is in this larger context. It is no longer adequate today to think superficially about events and circumstances. We need to plumb the depths, for otherwise nothing much will result from all that we undertake. But society today finds it very difficult to get used to the insights arising in this realm from a science of the spirit. This became apparent to me very recently in a bizarre way, all the more bizarre because it emerged from an act of kindness. I was busy preparing the new edition entitled The Philosophy of Freedom, which is due to come out soon, I was a young man when I first wrote this book, 32 or 33, a very long time ago. And as I worked on the new edition, this brought certain things back to mind. As I have described in the journal Das Reich, I was very gratified by a response from Edward von Hartmann, the author of title The Philosophy of the Unconscious, with whom I was corresponding at the time. I sent him my Philosophy of Freedom, and he wrote various remarks in his copy, and then let me see these comments. I wrote them down and still have them. You see, this was a very kind deed on his part, and I was extremely grateful, and yet it was the cause of what I am about to relate. In the Philosophy of Freedom, I first presented the nature of spirit in the form of self-comprehending thinking. And this is because we only truly grasp the spirit if we actually experience it in self-comprehending, self-founded thinking activity. But as this became clear to me, I found it necessary to speak about some things in a different way from others who see matters differently. I therefore formulated this sentence: idea is an individualized concept, and a concept is experienced intuitively in the mind. The idea is an individualized concept, and the capital I relates it to an outward object. This is one of the sentences that Edward von Hartmann had underlined, noting the following, quote, "That is an unusual way of using words," close quote. As you can see, it was very kind of him to engage with me, and yet at the same time highly characteristic. To compare something major with something minor, one might say the following. When Copernicus expressed the idea that the sun does not revolve around the earth but the earth around the sun, someone might equally well have noted in the margin that this was an unusual way to describe things. Naturally, we need an unusual formulation to characterize something new. Yet you see that in the very quarter where one might have hoped for understanding, the response is an unusual way of using words. As we see very clearly in this example, if people never allowed themselves to coin new formulations, there would be no progress in the spiritual domain or any other. Even the very words that spiritual science employs meet with dismissal wherever we turn. Old views of the world are very worn out now, like an old coat. And the words in which they are formulated are no use even to these views themselves. The National Clothing Exchange Office would not even accept such ragged word garments if they were offered it. But people do not notice the redundancy of a worldview founded on tired formulations in their inner life. We need to develop a sense for this, and this is part of what people will have to find today if they are to understand the age we live in. We must understand these times. We must take such things to heart, for otherwise partisan interests can use their secret knowledge to gain the upper hand, whereas all humanity should be served by this knowledge. Even the best knowledge, if exploited for vested interests, for the power of a few, will turn into a calamity for humanity. The end of Lecture 11.